Welcome to Search the Scriptures Daily, a radio ministry of the Berean Call with Dave Hunt and T.A. McMahon. I'm Gary Carmichael. Thanks for joining us. Coming up in this week's program, in our Understanding the Scriptures segment, Dave and Tom will resume their exploration of the Gospel of John. And, can you hate Jesus and love the Father? In Religion in the News, does your boss provide a prayer room? We'll take a look at that story and examine the question, is the Greek Orthodox Church the only right one? We hope you can stay with us. Our ministry, the Berean Call, offers many teaching materials, including books, tracts, audio and videotapes, and copies of our weekly broadcast on tape or compact disc. You may also subscribe to our monthly newsletter, which we offer free of charge. We'll let you know how to order later in the program. Now, this week's cover article. We continue with our series of discussions based on Dave Hunt's book From Harvest House, with the 17th installment of A Cup of Trembling. And along with Dave Hunt, here's T.A. McMahon.
Thanks, Gary. You're listening to Search the Scriptures Daily, a program in which we encourage everyone who desires to know God's truth to look to God's Word for all that is essential for salvation and living one's life in a way that is pleasing to Him. In this segment, we're going through Dave Hunt's book, A Cup of Trembling. We've been looking at it for a number of weeks. The subtitle is Jerusalem and Bible Prophecy. And Dave, I think, among other things in the book, the real value of it is giving its readers historical background. Why is what we see going on in Jerusalem, what's the basis for it? What's the basis for the problems in Israel and so on? And I think the book really delivers in that part.
The basis for it, Tom, you wouldn't find in any great significance of this tiny city, Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. Its location, its beauty, you would find much more significance in New York or London and so forth. And yet, it is a fulfillment of prophecy. It's astonishing.
Right. One of the problems for most people is that there are all different ideas about it, particularly in the press. You know, we would be of the mindset that from our research, what we see going on is that the press is biased against Israel.
Absolutely.
But on the other hand, we just had in our small community, we're about 50,000 here in Bend, Oregon. We had an individual who came to town, was sponsored to come here. He was with Aramco for 20-some years, lived in Saudi Arabia, walked and talked with the royal family, knows Saudi Arabia well from his experience. And a couple of our staff members went to hear him speak, and their view was that he had another perspective on this. And he claimed, and he was concerned, that the press here in the United States wasn't being fair with Saudi Arabia. He also mentioned that a number of times, or I won't say he mentioned, but it came out that he was pretty anti-Israel. So there's one voice. Here he is, he shows up in Bend with a perspective, and he was pretty influential in this community with regard to the response that people had from listening to him. But they didn't have the other side. They didn't have the benefit of reading certainly A Cup of Trembling or other books out there that are factual and historical.
Tom, I wasn't there, but I can guarantee you when he's complaining that we're not being fair with Saudi Arabia, he did not mention that every Jew was killed by Muhammad, that no Jew is allowed to set foot in Saudi Arabia, that you must be a Muslim to be a citizen of Saudi Arabia, that no non-Muslim can build a place of worship, and on it goes. There is no freedom of thought, of the press, of religion, of conscience, and so forth. Now, how we could be unfair, we don't even report that in the press, and yet he thinks we're unfair? Tom, it's incredible. But anyway.
But again, Dave, the heart of the book is historical fact. But more than that, historical fact from a biblical perspective. Now, there's history.
Well, history was written before it happened. Mm-hmm. That's prophecy.
Prophecy. And Dave, over the last 2 weeks, we went over 10 major prophecies. Now, I don't want to belabor it, but I do want to go down for the sake of our listeners who maybe missed one of our previous programs. Let me quickly list the 10 major prophecies, and then I want to take off from there, okay? Number 1, God promised a land of clearly defined borders. 2, God brought his chosen people into the promised land. 3, God warned his chosen people that if they did not obey him, he would cast them out of the land. 4, God declared that his people would be scattered to every nation on the face of the earth. 5, God warned that his people would be mistreated wherever they went. 6, God warned that his people would be persecuted and killed. 7, God said that his people would not be completely destroyed, but he would preserve them as an ethnic group, a identifiable ethnic group. 8, God would bring them back into their land. 9, God declared that in the last days Jerusalem would become a, quote, cup of trembling, a burdensome stone for all people, end of quote. And 10, God would make Israel, quote, like an hearth of fire among the wood to devour all the people round about, end of quote. Dave, these are the prophecies, but I have to ask the question, God scattering his people. We know that for 70 years, the Israelites were taken off to Babylon. Why would that be?
Well, the Bible tells us why. When God brought them into the land, he said there will not only be a Sabbath every seventh day, there will be a Sabbath every seventh year. And every seventh year you will let the land lie fallow for 1 year. You will not till the soil. You will forgive all fellow Jews of any debts they owe you, and you will release all fellow Israelite slaves. And for 490 years, they never did it once. Mm-hmm. And at the end of that time, God said, you owe the land 70 Sabbaths. You wouldn't refrain from tilling the soil, I'll remove you, so you can't till it. You wouldn't forgive the debts owed to you, I'll take away everything. And you wouldn't let the slaves go free, I'll make you the slaves in Babylon. And so it happened.
So it's not like God jumped on them right away. It's, 490 years. Well, the reason I'm bringing that up is that sometimes when we look at the Old Testament and we see, we have an idea about how God is and how he works, and more often than not, we miss the heart of God, that he is loving and patient and long-suffering. 490 years.
Right.
It's pretty patient.
Yeah, he's very patient. On the other hand, of course, there was a reason behind it, because that was the length of time they would be in captivity. And that was the length of time it would take them eventually, with all the trials they faced, to complete rebuilding the temple that Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed. It all works out in God's way. How he does it, it's amazing.
Yeah. So that began the captivity, the scattering. And then after that, as we mentioned earlier, God was going to restore them in the last days. But the Babylonian captivity wasn't the only scattering. They were, I'm thinking of 70 A.D., where the Romans came in and destroyed Jerusalem, basically. And there were other scatterings.
I have a friend, Tom, I don't think you've met him, and his group of Jews, they traced themselves back to the Babylonian dispersion. They ended up in Soviet Georgia, what was Soviet Georgia. And he said that they kept everything, all their customs, all their keeping of the law, their practice of Judaism and so forth. They kept it exactly as they brought it out of Babylon. And then they have all gone en masse. They all went to Israel.
Dave, the promises that we went over, really the prophecies, the promises, that this is what God was going to do, he preserves a Jewish remnant. That was imperative. He had to. Just the example that you just gave. God did this all over the world among the Jews. And he had to do that in order for his prophecies, for his promises to be fulfilled. There had to be an identifiable ethnic Jewish group.
Exactly, and it had to include all 12 tribes.
And this is over a period of 2,500 years or more.
Right. Amazing that these people could be scattered, persecuted, hated, killed, and we talked about it in the last program, I think. I would want my daughters to marry Gentiles. Let's change our name. Mm-hmm. Why? God's chosen people. What has that gotten us? But in fact, they did remain identifiable. Tradition? How could tradition be so strong? They keep the Passover as exactly as God said they would. Mm-hmm. So here we have, well, you just read off 10 specific prophecies that have been fulfilled. The whole world has witnessed the fulfillment. And these are the prophecies, among many others, that God offers as proof that he exists, he is God, and that the Bible is his word. And you have nothing like this in the Quran or mm-hmm. the Hindu Vedas or anywhere. Mm-hmm. No one can be an atheist, Tom. You can't be an agnostic. You can't deny it. There it is. And there are more prophecies about Jerusalem, and just the prophecies about Jerusalem alone are more than sufficient to prove that God is God and the Bible is his word.
Mm-hmm. And Dave, we have the benefit of history to look back and see how these things unfolded. And that's one aspect of your book that I really appreciate. You give details with regard to how this really last day's return of the Jews, how mm-hmm. it came together. Mm-hmm. But I'd like you to just kind of go over some of those points. For example, the Balfour Declaration in 1917. What was that about?
Well, that was Lord Balfour. They recognized the necessity, number one, of a return of the Jews to their homeland. They recognized that what was called Palestine at that time really belonged to the Jews. And the British government pledged itself to bring this about. And I don't know whether we mention it in the book, but it was because of a Jewish chemist, a brilliant man, Chaim Weizmann. And the British military in World War I were running out of acetone, which is essential for explosives. And they asked him, could he come up with a synthetic acetone? He came up with a synthetic that was better than the natural and really saved Britain in that war. And because of this, they said, well, what can we do to repay you? Mm-hmm. And it was Chaim Weizmann who said, please help my people to get back into their ancient land that God promised to them. And that was the Balfour Declaration. The British government recognized their indebtedness to him. They recognized the ownership, or that the Jews belonged in that land, and they pledged that they would bring it back.
And that took place in the 20s. There was immigration back to, well, we call it Palestine. That was their name for it. But
well, there had been immigration, of course, for mm-hmm. some time, but it was not recognized as a land that belonged to the Jews. That was what he wanted. Give us some recognition that we have a national identity. We're not just wandering people. And that shouldn't there be some designation? You see, what most people don't remember, or maybe never knew, those nations over there, and again, I think we've mentioned this, Tom, but we can refresh minds. Those nations over there were part of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Ottoman Empire, which for 400 years controlled the entire Middle East. There were no independent nations there. So it was the Allied victors of World War I who created Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Egypt. I mean, Egypt didn't get its full independence from England until 1946. So when the Turks were on the wrong side in World War I, and the British and the French and so forth took over the administration of the entire Middle East, they created these nations. And so Chaim Weizmann said, you're creating various nations for the Arabs. I mean, they're getting 99.9% of this area. Could you save a little for us? After all, that's where my people came from. That was agreed to. And in 1922, there was the Declaration of Principles by the League of Nations, which was basically the victorious nations in World War I. And the Declaration of Principles recognized, in fact, that all of what was called Palestine belonged to the Jews. And it was to be set apart for the Jews, administered by Great Britain. Tragically, Britain betrayed the Jews. They kept the Jews out or limited very low level of immigration that they allowed. And they allowed Arabs to flood in. And many of these people who call themselves Palestinians and say they've been there, their ancestors for more than 1,000 years, it isn't true. They are recent immigrants from the nations all around them. And then the British even refused to accept 500,000 Hungarian Jews in 1944. Hitler hadn't yet invaded Hungary and done away with the Jews. And Britain said there's no room in Palestine for them. Hitler offered to sell them for $2 apiece. For $1 million, you could have saved 500,000 Jews from the ovens, and Britain refused. And you remember they drove skeletal survivors of the Holocaust in rickety ships within sight of the promised land. They drove them back. The British Navy did. What Britain did is horrendous. Their prejudice against the Jews and their determination, really, to prevent what they had promised they would do. They betrayed Chaim Weizmann, and they betrayed their word. They betrayed the Balfour Declaration. And you can count the demise of the British Empire upon which the sun never sank. From the time they betrayed the Jews, we've mentioned this, I think, in the past, God said, I will curse those who curse you. But anyway, this was history foretold in advance, the fulfillment of prophecy.
Dave, why didn't in 1946, the Anglo-American Committee recommended the admittance of Jewish refugees, but they still didn't pull back the British blockade? How did that work?
Tom, you tell me. I don't know. You see, when you study the history of modern Israel, it becomes more and more and more a miracle. When you consider everything that was against them, the nations of the world, and that they got a vote in November 29th, 1947, that Palestine would be partitioned. And the United Nations voted. Russia voted. The U.S. voted. And that they would get, well, actually they gave them 18% of Palestine. And the Israelis accepted it. What else could they do? And the Arabs were not happy. The Arabs rioted, they attacked, and the British, in fact, were helping them, standing by when unarmed Jewish people in Palestine, so-called, were being slaughtered by armed Arabs. Anyway, they got 18% of what they had been promised. And then when they declared their independence, actually, even the United States backed away. The nations that had voted partition backed away. And when Israel declared its independence, May 14th, 1948, they were instantly attacked by the regular armies of 6 Arab nations with, tanks and planes, and the whole world thought Israel wasn't going to survive. There was no way they could survive. But God said he would protect them. He would make them like fire that would devour the nations around them. Ezekiel 12, verse 6, you read it.
Right.
One of your
seems like they were only a candle at that particular time anyway. They had nothing.
And yet, they destroyed the Arabs who attacked them.
Yeah.
And they took more land. They had been given such a narrow strip of land.
Indefensible, right?
It was indefensible. They had to take some higher ground. They had to widen their borders. You could just push right through in a few minutes with a tank. So 10 miles wide in some places. But amazingly, as God said, he would preserve them. And I love Well, I love the whole Bible, but when you get to Jeremiah 31, beginning at verse 8, God says, I'll say to the north, give them up. I'm going to bring them from the ends of the earth. They're going to come back weeping and women with babies and so forth. And in verse 10, God says, nations of the earth, you listen to me. I am the one who scattered Israel, and I will regather her, and you better watch out what you do with her. Mm-hmm. And the nations of this world are going to be judged for their treatment of Israel. Now, that doesn't mean that Israel is perfect.
Right. Dave, with regard to the last days prophecies, some other events took place that are totally amazing. The break-up of the Soviet Union, that had a great impact on Israel.
Yeah.
And one of the things I'd like you to talk about that maybe most of our listeners are not aware of is the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. This would be Scoop Jackson, one of our legislators.
Well, at the height of the Cold War, Jackson and Vanik co-authored an amendment that made the granting of most favored nation status to the USSR conditional on the right of its citizens to emigrate. They were keeping them from leaving. Mm-hmm. Why they would do that when they're mistreating them anyway, I don't know. So that had a big impact. And the floodgates, you might say, were opened. Mm-hmm. And about 1 million Jews have come from the former Soviet Union now. Russian is a major language in Israel.
Right. Dave, let me quote. You have a quote in here from Natan Sharansky, who was, again, a Jew in the Soviet Union.
Very well known.
And this is his reaction to what Senator Henry Jackson really did. He says, I first heard of the Jackson Amendment when I became active in the dissident movement in 1973. Only later did I learn there was a person called Jackson. There are 3 landmarks in my life before leaving the Soviet Union: the Yom Kippur War, the Entebbe operation, and my arrest. But throughout, there was the Jackson Amendment. Suddenly, we refuseniks realized we had a real ally. As Zionists, we had a spiritual weapon, our Jewish heritage. But now we also had a historical and practical weapon, the Jackson Amendment. The Soviet authorities immediately began blackmailing us. The KGB began detaining us, telling us it would become worse for us. I sent hundreds of letters from refuseniks and dissidents, including Andrei Sakharov, to Jackson by tourists, encouraging him to keep up his fight. He was our symbol of hope. The Jackson Amendment, was the turning point not only for the exodus of the Jews, but in the ultimate victory of the West over the Soviet Union in the Cold War.
Well, God has used many people as his instruments to bring these things about. The major point is he foretold what would happen, and it has happened, and you cannot deny it. And Israel is the chief sign that God has given to this world.